Good morning, ladies. I hope you've had a great week and you're looking forward to the weekend and worshiping with your fellow believers. I want us to think today about a wounded faith. Think about a wound. Some of them are very simple, maybe a little paper cut or a hangnail, but some of them are really big. Some require first aid, and some of them require stitches or maybe even an antibiotic. But in today's passage in 2 Samuel chapter 9, I see a woman who I think her faith may have been wounded a little bit. And so I want to give you this setting. We go back to 1 Samuel chapter 30, and what we find is confusion and fear reign in Israel because the Philistines are on the move. What you see in verses 1 to 4 is that the Philistines were fighting against Israel, and the men of Israel fell slain at Mount Gilboa, and they killed Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, the three sons of Saul. And the battle presses hard against Saul, and an arrow finds him, and he asked his armor bearer to kill him so that the Philistines wouldn't, but the armor bearer would not do that. So what does Saul do? He falls on his own sword. And so if you get to 2 Samuel chapter 4, we kind of are at the point where the news of the battle has gotten back home. And in the first verse, we read that all of Israel was dismayed. And that's what allows us to meet the lady that we're going to talk about today, who is unnamed, but she's a nurse. And in verse 4, we find that the Bible tells us Jonathan, the son of Saul, had a son who was crippled in his feet. He was 5 years old. When the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, which is where the battle took place, his nurse took him up and fled. And as she fled in haste, he fell and became lame, and his name was Mephibosheth. I looked at the meaning of that name, and it means dispeller of shame, which is an interesting detail that we'll cover at the end. One commentator suggested that Mephibosheth's mother had already passed away, and that this nurse was in full charge of this young boy. Another suggested that she might have even been his wet nurse and nursed him when he was an infant and toddler. But where we meet her is the news of this disastrous battle comes back to Jezreel, from Jezreel back to where they are, and her first thought is he's heir to the throne. And so she picks him up and flees. And in that event is when he becomes lame in his feet. If you think about it, at the beginning, it tells us he's lame, and then it tells us he's crippled. And the difference is maybe he could walk some, and then he isn't able to walk. But whichever happened, what we do know is Mephibosheth was in this nurse's care when that second event occurred. And so what do we find out? We're told that she flees to Lodabar in the mountains of Gilead, and we know from 2 Samuel chapter 9 that she took Mephibosheth to the house of Machir, who was the son of Ammiel. And commentators believe that Machir was very wealthy, that he was a supporter of the house of Saul, and all the way in chapter 17 in 2 Samuel, we read that he was a gentleman who helped David. But I want you to think about this nurse as we are women. Can you imagine the angst in her heart, the deep concern, the worry, even the anxiety that she experienced? Her intentions were good. She was trying to protect this young boy from the invading Philistines. But you know what? I also think she would blame herself for the lifelong result of that accident. But let me ask you, have you ever done something with a heart of gold that turned out and backfired? And what you intended is not what was received? You had to live with those consequences, didn't you? Well, that happens for this nurse. So what happens in chapter 9 is David has been crowned king in chapter 5. He's rising to power up through chapters 8. And when we get to chapter 9, we begin to see his kindness. David and Jonathan were very close friends. And back in 1 Samuel chapter 20, they made a promise to each other. Remember, Saul is trying to kill David because he wants Jonathan to sit on the throne. Jonathan, on the other hand, has accepted God's will. God's chosen David to be the king, and he's fine with that. But his dad isn't. And so David's now on the throne, and he asked, is there anyone still left of the house of Saul, that I may show kindness to him for Jonathan's sake? And there was. There's a servant by the name of Ziba, and David calls him and asked him the same question again. Is there anyone in the house of Jonathan that I may show kindness? And he says, well, Jonathan has a son, but he's crippled in his feet. And you know what David says? Where is he? And so Ziba said, he's in Lodabar at the house of Machir. And David sends and brings Mephibosheth to himself. When Mephibosheth gets there, we're told in verse 6 that he bows on his face and pays homage to David. And when David calls him by name, he responds, behold, I am your servant. Now, let's back up a minute and think about Mephibosheth's emotions. How must he have felt when David's entourage arrived to get him? He was heir to the throne. Did he have questions? Did he wonder what the king wanted? We're not given any of those details. But his grandfather, Saul, would have been the only king this young man would have known. I think he was probably too young to know about the vow that Jonathan and David made to each other, but I wonder if he even ever heard a story that he would remember. But I love the way in verse 7 of chapter 9 that David responds to Mephibosheth. He says, do not fear. I will show kindness to you for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father, and you will eat at my table always. So, Mephibosheth then responds, who am I? Why would you do this to me? I'm a dead dog. But the king then calls in Ziba and said, all that belonged to Saul and to all of his house I've given to your master's grandson. Now you and your sons and your servants are to till his land and bring in the produce so that your master's grandson has food to eat. But Mephibosheth will always eat at my table. And then we're given this little detail that Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. And Ziba responds, all that you've commanded, so will we do. And then we're told that Mephibosheth has a young son. His name was Micah. And all who lived in Ziba's house became Mephibosheth's servants. Okay, friends, that's 35 presumably men, 15 sons and 20 servants. What about the women? What about the children? But do you see what David did? Here was the crippled son, the poor crippled son of Jonathan. And David lifts him to a place of honor to sit at his table with his own biological children. But he gives provision to take care of Mephibosheth's family, which will include Ziba's family, the ones who will work the fields to provide for Mephibosheth's family. So let's go back to that nurse, who I think was probably very wounded, and her faith may be shaken during this event that occurred when Mephibosheth was 5. Regardless of how it happened, I mean, I think about my 5-year-old grandson. If I picked him up, which I don't now, but if I did, I could very likely drop him. Or if he wiggled, he could do a backflip out of my arms. But I know, don't you think, well, I don't know because I don't know this lady personally, but I think as she looked at him for all those years, she would have that little tinge of guilt. I wish he hadn't fallen or I hadn't dropped him. But I want us to look at what God did, because Mephibosheth's life was spared because of her action. He was heir to the throne, even though he was only 5 years old, and the Philistines were coming. David would care for this poor crippled son for the rest of his life. But David was able to fulfill a vow he made to Jonathan. Mephibosheth considered himself a dead dog, not worthy of his mercy. But to me, that's like, neither are we worthy of God's mercy. Each of us are sinners because of the fall. And yet we're candidates for God's grace because of what Christ did on Calvary. His work on Calvary lifts us out of our shame, and he adopts us as sons and daughters, which is kind of what David did to Mephibosheth. And what does God do? He gives us eternal life. Only God. Do you see how what wasn't good in this lady's life, God used for good? So, for me and you, there are many times things happen and we don't think they're good. We don't see the positive. But we have to rely on the fact that God is working all things for our good. And what else is he doing? He's accomplishing his purpose and his plan. We see today, he sees eternity. I hope you have a great week.